Hello, this is Chris, and welcome to this new series entitled The Constant Gardener. So, what are we going to be talking about? There's an issue that has kept cropping up this year, so I decided to look into it. And that's that I keep hearing either people express or other people telling me that other people have expressed to them that they struggle with the God of the Old Testament. Of course, there are very difficult events like the destruction of Jericho, which are very appetizing. And a lot of people find this difficult to see as the same God that we see in Jesus. And I think if that's how we feel, it's important that we do articulate such feelings. In my view, it's not a problem that I struggle with. I think in a lot of ways it's because of the childhood I had, in which I was brought up from a very young age with a very positive view of God, and I felt I experienced God even as a child. So by the time I was of an age to confront these difficult issues in the Bible, my view of God was already formed, and therefore I saw these issues through the lens of a positive lens, and didn't struggle with it, even if I found the events distasteful. I remember I had a Ladybird book of David and Goliath, and the last picture was David holding up Goliath's head, which I didn't like very much. But nonetheless, it didn't cause me to question God. But I like the approach of Gregory Boyd in an article he wrote, in which he said what the best approach he thinks is to trust that, as Paul said, Jesus is the fullness of God. So all these people that I'm talking about who've expressed this issue with God have said they don't struggle with Jesus. They like Jesus. It's the God that they see in the Old Testament that they struggle with. And yet Paul tells us that Jesus is the fullness of God. And Jesus himself said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So as Gregory Boyd said, we have to take that as the true image of God, the true representation of God, and therefore trust that what we see happening in the Old Testament was necessary, maybe for reasons we cannot understand, but put our trust in the God we see in the parable of the prodigal son, which demonstrates Jesus' view of God. So why is it then that God has this image problem? I think a lot of it is the way that we view the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole. And we can see individual incidents and we make judgments on those individual incidents as though they occur in isolation. And I think it's important to understand that the Bible is not a collection of isolated incidents, but one continuous story. And it's a story that is moving towards a goal. It's a story with momentum and direction. It strikes me as odd that an author of fiction such as John le Carre, you may have recognized the title Constant Gardener as one of his novels. It strikes me as odd that someone like him, who has complete control over plot and how to tell the story and how the story ends, should choose an unhappy ending. I have read The Constant Gardener, you may have read it or seen the film, but it falls into the same unhappy ending category that many of le Carre's novels do. Some of his novels are absolutely superb, but more often than not, they have an unhappy ending. So I have to say I'm reluctant to read them now. And if you don't like an unhappy ending, steer clear of John le Carre. So the Bible is one continuous story, but unlike the novels of le Carre and any other fictional author, it's a true story. And God, as creator stroke author, has determined that this is a story that will have a happy ending. But God's intentions to produce that happy ending have, almost from the word go, been met by a rebellious cast. And I think we have to see the Old Testament in this context, that God is striving towards a particular purpose, a particular ending, which is ultimately redemption in Jesus. And he was doing so, pushing against a tide of rebellion. And I think we have to see the incidents in the Old Testament in this context. So why the title Constant Gardener? We're going to be looking at two stories that I think show that the God of the Old Testament is the same God that we see in Jesus, and the same God that Jesus describes in the parable of the prodigal son. And as such, I think we're going to see that God is, from the beginning to the end of the Bible, a constant. That's the constant. Gardener, that's a bit more loose. Israel is depicted as a vineyard and a vine. And in John 15, Jesus describes himself as the true vine and God as the vine grower. So I'm vine grower. So I'm using the title gardener a little bit loosely based on that. Thus the constant gardener. So we're looking at this theme about the constancy of God's character. And we're doing so through looking at biblical narrative and how biblical narrative works. So the title of this first class is The God of Happy Endings. So obviously we're a body of disciples who try to, as best we can, follow the Bible. And that's never quite as easy as it sounds, but it's particularly difficult given that 40% of the Bible is narrative. And that narrative rarely has explicit commentary. People do this and people do that, but it rarely says whether that was good or bad, that action. There are a few examples where it does, but not many. But there is a lot of implicit commentary. But to perceive this implicit commentary, we must have an understanding of how biblical narrative works. So by way of illustration, I don't know about you, but breakfast might be the simplest meal of the day, but I always look forward to it, even though bar seasonal changes, I have exactly the same breakfast every day. But one way in which it was even more exciting as a child was that there would sometimes be little free gifts inside the cereal packet, and I would sometimes choose what cereal I was going to have that week according to whether there were free gifts or not. But actually the best free gift I ever received was the novel you see on the right. Another author of spy fiction, Len Deighton, he's probably my favorite fictional author. And unlike Le Carre, he doesn't suffer from unhappy ending syndrome. And this was actually, I was no child anymore. This was in 1997 I got this, and I remember that because that's the year that Caroline and I did a tour of Zimbabwe, and I remember that that's the book I read on that holiday. What I discovered on beginning the novel was that it was actually, it was part of a trilogy called Faith, Hope and Charity, but that in itself was the third of 3 consecutive trilogies, plus there was a prequel called Winter, all around the Cold War in Berlin. And it said in the cover, the stories can be read in any order and each one is complete in itself. And indeed, just reading Faith in isolation, even though it comes near the end, it was a good story. I think reading it in any order is a recipe for confusion and certainly a lot of spoilers, but think how much more I would have got out of it when I started at the beginning, as I did. I've actually gone through the whole thing twice. Imagine how much more I would have got out of it the second time, having seen the development of characters, the development of the plot line. I'd have got so much more comprehension about the things that were happening. And I think this is the same with the Bible. Understanding narrative. So there's the issue of story structure is very important in ancient documents in a way it simply isn't anymore. And there's a lot of things like what we call chiasma, which is about a plot line that where one event is a kind of reflection of another event. Then there's a word plays. So for example, the word the Hebrew word for son is very similar to the Hebrew word for stone. And you see plays on that, and that happens in many different ways with different words. The two things that we're going to focus on in this class series is character and story references and themes. So character and story references. So as well as there being little implicit, a little explicit commentary, there's actually very little detail in biblical narrative. So when details are given, we know they're important. The narrator has put that detail in for a reason. Matthew, for example, gives us no description of Jesus or the 12 disciples, but he does tell us what John the Baptist wore. Why? In verse 4 of chapter 3 of Matthew, it says, John's clothes were made of camel's hair and he had a leather belt around his waist. What we can see when we understand that the Bible is a continuous story and John the Baptist is fulfilling the prophesied return of Elijah as described in Malachi 4:5, we can see that Matthew has put that detail in because he wants to identify John the Baptist as Elijah. He wants to make sure we don't miss that. So in 2 Kings 1:8, it said, gives a description of Elijah. He had a garment of hair and had a leather belt around his waist. And we look at Matthew's description of John. His clothes were made of camel's hair and he had a leather belt around his waist, an almost identical description. Matthew wants to make sure we understand that John is the embodiment of the return of Elijah. Biblical themes, and there's some major themes running through the Bible. Probably the most significant is life from death, which we see going all the way back to Abraham and Isaac, and obviously being fully realized in the resurrection of Jesus. But there's also the closely related theme of exile and restoration, which we're going to be looking at in this series. So let's then look at some examples of narrative and how it works. First of all, the story of Abraham and Pharaoh. So in Genesis, we see the story where Abraham and Sarai at that stage go to Egypt to escape famine, and they encounter Pharaoh, and Abraham tells Sarai, his wife, to say that she's his sister. And we focus on that as a lie, and here's this man lauded for his faith, installed into this covenant of promise, and yet so quickly afterwards he's come into a difficult issue and he resorts to lying. But the narrator wants us to focus on something, not necessarily something else, but at least something as well as that. And that seems to be a parallel between these events with Abraham and Pharaoh and the subsequent enslavement and exodus of the descendants of Abraham. So in both instances, there's a journey to Egypt as a result of famine, first Abraham and Sarai, and in the second case, the sons of Jacob in Genesis 41:46. Then we have Sarai taken into Pharaoh's household, paralleling the enslavement of the Hebrew people by Pharaoh. Then in both instances, we have God sending plagues, and in both we have the relevant parties leaving enriched. Obviously, the Hebrews leave with Egyptian gold. It's important to understand that this narrative occurs over a period of time. Many books, at least, have evolved over a period. For example, Genesis clearly has been updated from whatever its original form was, because it has place names that wouldn't have been original and some details that wouldn't have been original. And some commentators believe that Genesis wasn't finalized into the form that we have now until the time of the exile. And the key thing here is that this doesn't imply that the stories are fictional and details have been amended as it's evolved to tell a completely different story, but rather the narrators are presenting the stories to bring out particular points, like we've just looked at that way, that the story of Abraham and Sarah seems to be part of a pattern repeated in the enslavement of the Hebrews and the Exodus. So this is something else that we have to look for in appreciating what biblical narrators are telling us. So another example, Moses and Pharaoh. So we know the story where Moses visits his what he knows to be his true family, the Hebrew people, and he encounters an Egyptian abusing some of these slaves, and he kills him. And we tend to focus on the fact that Moses appears to have acted rather rashly and unlawfully, and pays the price by having to flee, leaving behind all the riches of his royal home and fleeing to Midian. But is this the message the narrator wants us to see? If you think about it, Moses kills one Egyptian official, he flees pursued by Pharaoh, and he waits in Midian for 40 years as a shepherd until God sends him back to rescue his people. And like Abraham before him, these events in Moses' life appear to foreshadow a national event, an event that occurred for the Hebrew people as a whole. So what Moses does to one Egyptian, God will do to Egypt as a whole. Moses fled as an individual, as the Hebrew slaves will flee en masse. And like Moses, they too will wait 40 years in the wilderness. So again, the narrator seems to be pointing to a repeated pattern. So what is the message of that story with Moses then, and what is the significance of the repetition? Stephen helps us understanding it in the speech he makes before he is stoned in Acts 7. He follows a typical Jewish practice of recapitulating the history of Israel, but similar to what we've described in biblical narrators, he picks out certain points in Israel's history that are making the case he wants to make. And the case that Stephen is making is that the rejection of Jesus is nothing new in Israel's history. So in Acts 7:23-25, it says, when he, that's Moses, was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his relatives, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his kinsfolk would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. So Stephen is telling us that the Hebrew slaves failed to recognize Moses as their savior in the same way that the Jews of his day failed to recognize Jesus as their savior. So his commentary implies that the 40 years that Moses waited in Midian wasn't a punishment for Moses, but rather a punishment for the slaves who failed to recognize Moses as their savior and therefore had to endure another 4 decades in slavery. On the other hand, when Moses flees, he encounters Zipporah and her sisters being harshly treated by shepherds, and he rescues them. And unlike the Hebrew slaves, they welcome Moses as their savior, and he indeed is given Zipporah in marriage. So this points towards the ultimate Gentile acceptance of Jesus and the rejection of Jesus by the Jews. So what does all this repetition mean? As I said at the start, the Bible is one continuous story moving to a goal, redemption in Jesus. So I think it's important to understand that part of the point that these biblical authors are making is that history doesn't just happen. incidents aren't isolated, but past, present, and future are all connected in this story that God is moving towards an end. And God has made this promise, begun with Abraham, and he is working to fulfill that promise, to produce the happy ending that he has always intended. And God will achieve that promise despite the constant failings of rebellious people. So in the next two classes, we're going to be looking at two examples of biblical narrative and how they fit the theme of exile and restoration. First of all, next time we'll be looking at the story of Ruth and Naomi, and in the third class we'll be looking at Jonah. Until then, thank you for watching.